Hello, all. A very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us for a talk hosted by the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society. My name is Nicole Chalet. I'm the president, and on behalf of the board, I welcome you and thank you for joining us. Gouverneur Morris was one of Alexander Hamilton's best friends, had very close to the Hamilton family, and so we love highlighting other members and friends of Hamilton's period. And so this talk will be diving into Gouverneur Morris as a leading founding father and his many contributions to the young American Republic, even though his name is less widely known today, as you will see from the titles of tonight's program. He was a true original and the founder's founder. So I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, Timothy R. Schantz. He is a senior financial executive. Mr. Schantz is a keen and long-standing Hamiltonian and a great enthusiast for Gouverneur Morris. He is currently active as a member of the Morrisania Project, endeavoring to restore the Morris family crypt at St. Anne's Episcopal Church in the South Bronx, and he is also an advocate to establish a historical marker between 2nd and 3rd and Market in Philadelphia in order to commemorate the crafting of the final draft of the U.S. Constitution by, quote, the penman of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, at Mrs. Daly's boarding house. Mr. Schantz holds a BA in history from Brown University and is a recipient of an award in historic preservation from the DAR. With that, I will turn it over to Timothy Schantz for a wonderful presentation on Gouverneur Morris. Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here in front of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and I appreciate very much you having me to talk about this unusual man with the odd name. And it probably is worthwhile to explore, why it is of such relevance to Alexander Hamilton and the society. So just again, I think you mentioned it, but to establish my own credentials in that regard, as John Herzog and Dick Silla and others would know, been a long-standing Hamilton enthusiast, long before any musical was ever produced about him. But that enthusiasm has expanded over time to, as Nicole mentioned, embrace the person that Eliza referred to as Alexander's best friend, quote unquote. I think it's a particularly apt time that we're having this conversation now. There's a lot of commentary in judicial circles about originalism. And also, I think it is fairly safe to say that virtually no day passes by without some reference to either Constitution or a crisis. So it's probably a good idea for us to be featuring this individual who, as Nicole mentioned, is generally
Got it.
the penman of the Constitution. And I would submit to all of you and hope to make the case that no originalist in interpretation can make judgments about the intentions of the founders without first passing through Gouverneur Morris. So he was in many dimensions, as is highlighted here, a true original, not least of which, as you can see depicted in this image of him, the Hintermeister image from 1925 of him signing the Constitution before George Washington. And of course, he's easy to pick out because if you look beyond his stockinged right leg, you'll see his famous wooden leg that defined him through most of his life and career, and certainly was the case by the time of the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to presume for purposes of this presentation, and it will allow me to move relatively rapidly through some of the slides that we have here, that many of you know a lot already about Gouverneur Morris. That having been said, I'm not going to make any particular assumptions, as I'm often struck in conversations with very well-informed people in the general public about how few people know who he is. And I'm not talking here about details or specifics as to his contribution to our country, but even just a general awareness of who Governor Morris actually was and why he is so significant to all of us. I will contend that it is time, in fact, arguably well past time, to pay due attention to this extraordinary individual, um, as he was and remains really a true original and a formative force in the creation of our nation. Let's, however, first begin with an ending, if I may, to further establish the credentials vis-a-vis Hamilton himself. And this ending, of course, is a tragic one because on the 12th of July, among the first calls that the family put out was to Gouverneur Morris as he rushed to Hamilton's side as he was on the verge of expiring from the duel. Um, he and everyone present, of course, was consumed with grief, but nonetheless, he reluctantly acceded to Eliza's request that he deliver the eulogy at Hamilton's funeral. And I want to just spend a quick moment on that because it says so much about Hamilton, but also about Gouverneur Morris. I'll quote directly from his speech. Shortly after the war, your favor, no, your discernment, called him to public office. You sent him to the convention at Philadelphia. He there assisted in forming that Constitution, which is now the bond of our Union, the shield of our defense, and the source of our prosperity. In signing that compact, he expressed his apprehension that it did not contain sufficient means of strength for its own preservation, and that in consequence we should share the fate of many other republics and pass through anarchy to despotism. However, we hoped better things. We confided in the good sense of the American people, and above all, we trusted in the protecting providence of the Almighty. He then goes on to say, for himself, referring to Hamilton, he feared nothing, but he did fear that bad men might, by false professions, acquire your confidence and abuse it to your ruin. Important watchwords for our times. And he concluded with the following testament. Bear this testimony to the memory of my departed friend. I charge you to protect his fame. It is all he has left, all that these poor orphan children will inherit from their father. But, my countrymen, that fame may be a rich treasure to you also. Let it be the test by which to examine those who solicit your favor. Disregarding professions, view their conduct, and on a doubtful occasion, ask, would Hamilton have done this thing? So I hope you get a clear sense of the admiration with which Gouverneur Morris held Alexander Hamilton in such high esteem. And it's good to observe that it was also quite well reciprocated. Here, in a letter from Hamilton to Gouverneur Morris in 1802, is his famous quote, "You, friend Morris, are by birth a native of this country, but by genius an exotic." I think a more carefully phrased and important observation about the relationship of these two great men couldn't have been made. That isn't to say, of course, that Hamilton was unaware of Morris's shortcomings, and the reverse was also true. But Hamilton had further things to say about Morris in the following light. He's a man of great genius, liable, however, to be occasionally influenced by his fancy, which sometimes outruns his discretion. And indeed, that will be one of the themes that pertains throughout this conversation. I wanted to put forward this particular image of the signing of the Constitution by Thomas Rossiter. I enjoy it in a very particular way because it wasn't only Hamilton who uh, asserted Morris's genius. Madison himself and the two were not great admirers of one another, acknowledged Morris's genius. Uh, but here is a particular insight to him written by the William Pearce, representative from Georgia at the Constitutional Convention, who had the following to say. Gouverneur Morris is one of those geniuses in whom every species of talents combine to render him conspicuous and flourishing in public debate. No man has more wit, nor can anyone engage the attention more than Mr. Morris. And indeed, that proved to be the case at the convention and even in times before and following. It's important to highlight this particular image here of Morris there with his peg leg sitting adjacent to Benjamin Franklin. I think because he and Franklin, although very different generations, of course, shared some very common characteristics. And here I'd like to turn to the famous Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who in 1886 wrote the following about the two individuals. Morris had a sharp wit, a strong sense of humor, and a capacity for amusing satire, which are to be seen in all his writings. If we accept Franklin, who was of an earlier generation, Gouverneur Morris holds in this respect a lonely preeminence among his friends and contemporaries. For the great men of our revolutionary and constitutional period were, it must be confessed, judging from their letters and journals, somewhat ponderous. Now and then we find a moment when we can laugh at them, but Morris is the only one of them, all with whom we laugh or smile in sympathy. This is enough of itself to make us to hold him in remembrance, but he was far more than merely an amusing companion or a writer of clever letters. And indeed, I think we are all familiar with Franklin's famous comments at the conclusion of the convention with respect to the rising sun and the chair behind George Washington, and his interesting comment about we have a republic if we can keep it. So it's good to turn to Morris's take on the whole occasion. And he said, in adopting the Republican form of government, I not only took it as a man does his wife, for better or for worse, but what few men do with their wives. I took it knowing all of its bad qualities. Quite an interesting observation from the man credited with actually crafting its final draft. So who was this relatively unheralded bright light at the founding of the country? Of course, here we have an image of him at the age of 27. He was a man born to privilege, it must be asserted. He was the last son of Lewis Morris and Sarah Gouverneur, whose surname he took as his primary, or was given as his primary. He derived famously from Welsh ancestry. His great-grandfathers having been part of the Cromwellian cause in the assault on Chepstow Castle in Wales, if any of you are familiar with that geography. They then went to Barbados before coming and acquiring land in the Bronx, which came to be known as Morrisania. And his father married into French Huguenot and Dutch ancestry through his marriage with Sarah Gouverneur. And that really helped define his general background at the time of his rearing. There's no doubt that he was something of a child prodigy. He graduated at the age of 16 from King's College, now Columbia University, and famously gave a commencement address on wit and beauty, and subsequently at his on his master's graduation was asked to give another, and his topic was love. So you can already get a sense that this is an unusual man with a very particular focus, and it's important to understand his perspectives on the passions that drive human endeavor. However, from wit and beauty, he progressed to the amiable art of lawyering and litigation, working with a prominent law firm in New York, received his laurels, if you will, in the profession at Fraunces Tavern in 1771, and went on to practice there during the very years of the beginning rumblings towards revolution. As I mentioned, he came from a prominent family, and it was one that had internecine strife within it. His elder half-brother, Louis, was a prominent signer of the Declaration of Independence, famously alleged to have observed when it was pointed out the dangers of signing that document, to have said, "Damn the consequences, give me the pen." However, the other half of his family, Stotts Morris, was a major general in the British Army. His mother was a loyalist sympathizer. The Morrisania estate was occupied by the British through much of the Revolution. So it could well have been, given the sympathies of King's College, the case that he sided with British interests. That was not to be the case, however. He became a fervent and enthusiastic participant in the rebellious cause, was at first a delegate to the New York Provincial Congress in 1775, then subsequently was elected as a delegate to the New York State Assembly, and together with Jay and others co-authored New York's first Constitution, in particular enshrining the elements of religious freedom and other fundamental rights for New Yorkers. However, having failed, despite a strenuous initiative, to achieve the goal of gradual emancipation in the Constitution, something that wasn't to happen in New York for another 20 years. From there, Morris went on to the Continental Congress and served yeoman's duty. He chaired any number of committees over the course of the war, was one of the true workhorses of the convention, of the Congress, excuse me, producing voluminous works that supported the cause and that ultimately led to the Articles of Confederation. Here, he proved to be one of the youngest signers of the Articles, and to my knowledge, I believe he remains the only person to have been a signer of both the Constitution and the Articles from two different states. Importantly, of course, in signing the Articles of Confederation, I'd like you to retain this for future reference, just beginning with the preamble of the Articles. It begins, "The delegates of the United States in Congress assembled agree to certain Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union." between the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, et cetera, et cetera. Very important to retain that for our subsequent conversation about the Constitution itself. Over the course of the Revolution, he authored or collected and edited the observations on the American Revolution, which was largely in response to the Carlisle Commission, the Peace Commission, sponsored by the British over the course of 1778, and in some respects became arguably among the first real Americans. In fact, in many of his public communications, he would sign it an American, which was an unusual reference at that early stage when many loyalties remained primarily with individual states. Sometimes it has been suggested that Morris had other affections and loyalties and the like, and I'd like to disabuse anybody of that particular notion, quoting from him later in life when he made the following very prescient observation. The proudest empire in Europe is but a bauble compared to what America will be, must be, in the course of 2 centuries, perhaps of 1. Imagination shrinks from the magnitude of rational deduction. He was, without question and without hesitation or reservation, one of the most ardent of patriots, one of the strongest believers in the American way forward, and as is captured here in his concluding paragraphs on the observations on the American Revolution, even though it's written here and you may read it, I would like to read it as well alongside, just because of the power of this statement, a clear and visionary analysis and expectation of what really could be for the United States, and arguably should well be appended on our Statue of Liberty alongside those immortal words of Emma Lazarus. In these trying times of our own, it is extraordinary to hear these words attributed to Gouverneur Morris. The portals of the temple we have raised to freedom shall then be thrown wide as an asylum to mankind. America shall receive to her bosom and comfort and cheer the oppressed, the miserable, and the poor of every nation and of every clime. The enterprise of extending commerce shall wave her friendly flag over the billows of the remotest regions. Industry shall collect and bear to her shores all the various productions of the earth, and all by which human life and human manners are polished and adorned. In becoming acquainted with the religions, the customs, and the laws, the wisdom, virtues, and follies and prejudices of different countries, we shall be taught to cherish the principles of general benevolence. We shall learn to consider all men as our brethren, being equally children of the universal parent, that God of the heavens and of the earth, whose infinite majesty for providential favor during the late Revolution, almighty power in our preservation from impending ruin, and gracious mercy in our redemption from the iron shackles of despotism, we cannot cease with gratitude and with deep humility to praise, to reverence, and adore. Really, quite an extraordinary sentiment. As I alluded to earlier, of course, Morris was seen to be quite a colorful character in multiple dimensions, one of which was certainly related to his loss of leg at a tender age in 1780. And yet it did little to hobble him in fundamental ways or stop his activity. He was a strenuous, outgoing, and vigorous person all of his life, despite his wooden leg, which is housed in the New York Historical Society, of which he became president or second president of the Historical Society. And I think his experience with this really unfortunate episode in a carriage accident in Philadelphia when he lost his leg is typified by two comments, one by Morris himself and the other by his great friend John Jay. The one by Morris was in response to observations and commiserations that were extended to him by many people, really trying to comfort him at the loss of his leg and make it seem not such a devastating loss to him, to which Morris replied playfully, "My good sir, you argue the matter so handsomely and so clearly and pull out so clearly the advantages of being without legs that I am almost tempted to part with another." By this time, however, his reputation as a somewhat licentious young man had already spread widely. Jay often referred to his pursuits of Venus in Philadelphia. And when he learned of Morris losing his leg, he made the following observation in part to comfort, but also to tweak his good friend, the governor. "Governor's leg has been a tax on my heart. I am almost tempted to wish he had lost something else." Moving on, not so well known is the fact that Gouverneur Morris, together with Robert Morris, with whom he bore no relationship, uh, was in effect the joint financier of the American Revolution. They came together in 1781 and importantly provided the financial wherewithal that allowed us to continue in the revolution during one of its lowest moments, candidly. And much of Robert Morris, who was a very successful entrepreneur at the time, an extremely wealthy man, he in turn attributed to the counsel and insights and observations of Gouverneur Morris. Morris, in addition, the governor, that is, was very important during other delicate periods in the revolutionary fight. He visited Valley Forge and was not only taken by the hardship of the troops there, but also a keen advocate for the initiatives around von Steuben and others to develop an effective military force, a strong advocate to Washington, an admirer of his leadership, helped face off some of the cabals that were amazingly present at that time against Washington's leadership, and became one of the firmest advocates for the general in the Continental Congress. He was assiduous in his work in drafting communications on military matters, on finance, many of which Hamilton took very close to heart, I have to say, and importantly also in foreign affairs. Uh, Unusually, he also became, over that period, a good partner and friend, not only to Robert Morris, but ultimately to George Washington himself. More on that later. And alongside of Robert Morris was an important investor in the first bank in the United States, the Bank of North America. Interestingly enough, and we'll come back to this later, but unlike many of these prominent individuals, Gouverneur Morris did not face their financial fate. I'm sure it's well known to many of you that sadly Robert Morris became a bankrupt and was in debtor's prison. James Wilson, the chair of the Committee of Detail, an equally humiliating end to his life. Of course, the Virginia dynasty, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, and sadly even Hamilton himself all faced extreme financial difficulties. But Gouverneur Morris was able, during the course of his life, to traverse the landscape effectively and to not only retain but to embellish his wealth. So that brings us to convention itself in the beautiful and important city of Philadelphia. May I pause here for a moment to say, go Birds! What an awesome Super Bowl. I'm not sure that those sentiments pertain overall, but you can tell that I'm pretty excited as a rabid Eagles fan. So let's come to the convention itself. As I mentioned earlier, much of the writings that Morris resorted to over the course of this period, especially in the 1780s, became foundational and absorbed by Hamilton. And ultimately, you can see reflections of it in his report on public credit in later years. But it was also very important in crafting the essence and establishing the framework of the governing principles of the Constitution itself. But I think it's important to recognize how different Morris was from many of the delegates to the convention, because he came there not only as a New Yorker representing the state of Pennsylvania, but as an American. And that sentiment was not wholly shared throughout the convention. And here's an interesting quote from Morris himself about his sentiments towards this. He said, "I come here as a representative of America. I flatter myself that I come here in some degree also as a representative of the whole human race, for the whole human race will be affected by the proceedings of this convention." And so it has been. Oh, by the way, in this depiction here of the Christie mural, which is in the U.S. Capitol, you can famously see all of your heroes, Hamilton there whispering in Franklin's ear down below Washington on the stand there. But overlooking Hamilton, just behind him there, is in fact Morris. You can't recognize him by his peg leg, but that is unmistakably him by his visage. I think almost all historians of the period would have to acknowledge Morris's critical contribution to the final draft of the Constitution. He was made one of the 5 members by ballot on the Committee of Style and Arrangement, which was charged with producing the final product. And indeed, it submitted its report ultimately on September 12th, having been put into form on the 8th of September. So 4 short days to draft this extraordinary document in its final form. And lest one be mistaken by its title, this was not a minor undertaking or simply dotting I's and crossing T's. This was a substantial revision of the document they received from the Committee of Detail. And of the committee, 5 distinguished individuals, Morris was the one charged with actually crafting it. Importantly, we will also note later that on 2 particular days, Morris, although he was assiduous about his attendance at the convention, did not appear on the 10th and 11th of September. This is very important for some of the subsequent information we're about to share with you. He was clearly chosen because of his already, I think, well-established reputation for genius, his gift of language and oration, his experience with the New York State Constitution, and because he also had been among the most formidable shapers of the Constitutional Convention itself, having spoken more than any other individual, despite being absent for a month of it, at 173 occasions. And it's interesting that notwithstanding Hamilton and Madison being part of this committee, drafted. So with all of that, isn't it a puzzle? Why has it been that Morris has fallen to the wayside in our collective memories of our founding fathers? Well, I think we can speculate at length on this topic, but I would probably put it into five major categories. The first of these is what I would refer to as the Churchill thesis, who famously observed at the time of the Second World War that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it. Well, indeed, our knowledge of the Constitutional Convention comes largely from Madison, who wrote the notes on the convention, but did so with many revisions and amendments over time. And in some ways, his almost grudging acceptance of the role of Morris is reflected in these comments, where he acknowledges without reservation in his 1831 note to Sparks, the finish given to the style and arrangement of the Constitution fairly belongs to the pen of Mr. Morris. The task having probably been handed over to him by the chairman of the committee, himself a highly respected member, and with the ready concurrence of the others, a better choice could not have been made, as the performance of the task proved. So even Madison, his rival as a Democrat Republican, and someone with whom he had fierce disagreements, as we'll see later, over the War of 1812 and other important issues facing the country, nonetheless acknowledged that in point of fact, it was Morris who was responsible for drafting the final version of the Constitution. That having been said, Madison, and as was often referred to, the Virginia dynasty ultimately prevailed in the form of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. And ultimately, that version of history is the one that took hold and captured the imaginations and memories of most Americans. In the course of that, of course, many Federalists were discredited, and Morris was overlooked. Indeed, we saw Hamilton was affected by much the same, but ultimately, because of his extraordinary stature as first Secretary of the Treasury, ultimately came to be resurrected, and as we know today, to be revered for his extraordinary contributions to our nation. Another feature that contributed, I think, to Morris's neglect was the fact that he didn't hold major office. He wasn't a cabinet member. He didn't run or seek high office in terms of the presidency or vice presidency or other important offices, although he did ultimately serve in the Senate when he returned. But I think that's another important reason for his neglect in history is that after the convention, he went to Europe and spent a decade away from the country doing the country's work while there, but was really out of the mainstream picture in the U.S. itself. Another important reason, I think, was what I already referred to, his dismay over the War of 1812 and the behavior of the Democrat-Republican Party in general. He viewed their assault on the Judiciary Act under Jefferson as another problematic area. And of course, the Federalist Party became discredited at the time of the Hartford Convention, when arguably the first seeds of secession took hold in the United States. And lastly, and probably one of the more important reasons, is already addressed in the comments about his fun-loving nature. He was not a dour, um, uh, overly serious individual. He looked at himself with a lighthearted perspective. He loved life. He loved women, it has to be said. He indulged those passions. And I think, particularly for 19th century and arguably 20th century Americans, having a founder that had too much fun was somewhat challenging in keeping him among the limelight among the greatest founders. And maybe a subtext of that is also because he represented Pennsylvania at the convention. Neither Pennsylvania nor New York, in a certain way, have ever regarded him as a favored son in the same degree as they have many of the other prominent members. So, what's being done to restore Morris to his rightful role as the penman of the Constitution and more? Well, I think there are a number of initiatives. The first relates to historiography. Just as a brief review, there was the sort of definitive biography of Morris going back to Jared Sparks in the 30s, 1830s, that is. But then a huge gap until none other than Teddy Roosevelt took up his cause and wrote a biography of him in the 1880s following the release of his diaries by his granddaughter Anne Carey Morris. And then we had a whole other gap until really the 1950s with Max Minks. And then really what has altered the landscape in historiography has been more recent work, beginning with a series of biographies of him, all very well done by Richard Brookhiser, by William Howard Adams, and by James Kirschke, all of which have been well received, if not overly well distributed and read and embraced by the American public. And importantly, I think some further developments are really helping restore his reputation. And I would like to single out here three individuals. Melanie Randolph Miller, who has diligently produced all of the diaries that Morris crafted over the course of his time in Europe, which are extraordinary testament to that era. His observations, particularly of the French Revolution and the terror that followed, are without peer. And her work, not only in creating that content, but also in writing about it and providing insight into his personality, are invaluable. Similarly, William Trainer, the Dean of Georgetown Law, has done a series of articles and now produced a book really reviving interest in Morris and his contribution to the Constitution, not just in the final draft, but throughout the course of the convention. And that has been also captured by Professor Dennis Rasmussen of Syracuse University, who has written a book on the penman of the Constitution. So lots of new developments in terms of great historiography to really change this overlooked condition that has pertained through much of the 19th and 20th centuries. Then we're going to spend a little bit more time today on talking about three other aspects of this initiatives that we're undertaking in Philadelphia, in the Bronx, and in support of the semi-quincentennial in Philadelphia as well. So one of the important points here is, I say, that in many histories of the era, Morris's reputation is pretty much confined to that Committee of Style and Arrangement. That does him an immense disservice because I would argue more than Madison that Morris's views at the Constitutional Convention and his readiness and extensive contributions to it during its course did more to really shape the ultimate document than probably any other individual, with the possible exception of James Wilson. And it's important to understand that his role went well beyond crafting those soaring words of our preamble, when for all time he changed the concept of sovereignty from a collection of states to we, the people of the United States. Uh, that is not just a change of phrase, it is absolutely instrumental in understanding the concept of sovereignty devolving from the people itself and not from a collection of entities. Importantly, also his restructuring of the Constitution, which was handed to him with 23 articles, reducing it to 7, equating as co-equal branches the executive, judiciary, and congressional branches, allotting each a single article, was an important framing mechanism for the Constitution. I won't go into detail tonight, obviously, but his contributions to the contract clause, to the vesting clauses, to establishing the constitution of the law of the land, and hinting at the future of judicial review, impeachment, the fugitive slave law, addressing new states, many, many important changes at the time of the Style and Arrangement Committee, but even well before that in shaping the document that went to the Committee of Detail, and that wonderfully curious committee of which he was also a member, the Committee of Postponed Parts, which was also a critical mechanism for addressing some of the unresolved issues from the Committee of Detail. He also importantly did some very subtle and nuanced things at the conclusion of the convention, driving the mechanism of the ratification process, coming up with an incredibly effective mechanism for representing unanimous signing of the states, when in point of fact in New York there was only one member still there in the form of Hamilton. And ultimately in crafting the letter that accompanied the distribution of the Constitution for George Washington, and that could well have been done in tandem with Alexander Hamilton. So here we have his signature, as you can see, at the base of the Pennsylvania delegation. The document itself, as it came out in the Pennsylvania packet and was distributed broadly. And here, as I already referenced, the letter that accompanied the distribution of the Constitution in his own handwriting there on the left, and as printed under the name of Washington. What's amazing, given his contribution to this whole cause and what might have been something that he would have celebrated and promoted himself over, Morris never really sought personal accolades for his contribution. He also was very modest in expectations about it. Many people subsequently, of course, referred to the Constitution with a reverence, referring to it as the quote unquote work of heaven. And it's interesting that Morris himself said the following: "It was the work of plain, honest men, and such I think it will appear." That was really his sentiment about the Constitution. Many of the founders had concerns and reservations as to whether it would persist over time, but their dedication to attempting to do so was without question. And that is for virtually all of them, but notably for both Hamilton and for Morris. So now that brings us to the question that we were thinking about before, as to where was the Constitution drafted? So for many, the immediate supposition is that it must surely have been Independence Hall. But think about the impracticality of that. And what we have pursued through the extraordinary diligence and research efforts of Adam Levinson is to uncover some critically important information about Gouverneur Morris and Hamilton, and where they actually were during the critical 4 days that the final draft was crafted. So here's an image from 4 of Morris, and the critical question: where did he actually stay when this was happening? And here is an image of Philadelphia at the time of Washington's death, but it characterizes well what Market Street, or at the time High Street in Philadelphia, would have looked like during the time of the Constitutional Convention. And here we have some interesting evidence from Morris's own bank records of payments that he made to Miss Daly. Why is that significant? Well, here we find and see that both Miss Daly and Morris are recognized as being based between Market or on Market between Second and Third Streets, which was the boarding house that she managed. Indeed, here we see the tax rolls in Philadelphia, where you can see Miss Daly again, different spelling, but the payments she made, and Gouverneur Morris just below for his time in Philly. And importantly, and now we really get to the, if you will, the smoking gun of the equation, the actual documentation that evidences where Gouverneur Morris stayed during those critical days. And here to highlight it so you can see it more readily, board and lodging between April 20th to May 31st. And we mentioned earlier how he left the convention to pursue business matters at Morrisania in the month of June. And then when he returned from June 30th to September 21st, encompassing those days of the 8th to 12th of September when the final draft of the Constitution was produced. This is an amazing find. Found by Adam at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. I'll skim over this, but this is just to evidence again that not only Morris was staying there, but also Gary and Hamilton as well at Miss Daly's, one of the prominent boarding houses in Philadelphia at the time. And importantly, one that drew a broad spectrum of abolitionist supporters to that boarding house, which is critically important as we go forward. So here we have another image of the signing of the Constitution. And I would like to before we get there, I wanted to highlight one other point that I overlooked in making. One of the reasons why we're so fixated in the context of Gouverneur Morris and the final draft of the Constitution on Miss Daly's boarding house is in Philadelphia, as many of you may know, there is a reconstructed version of the Graff House, commonly known as the Declaration House, where Thomas Jefferson famously penned the drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And I take absolutely nothing away from Jefferson's extraordinary contribution to our collective history. But it needs to be pointed out that that too was a committee of five, that he was the dedicated penman, but that unlike the final draft of the Constitution, there were multiple revisions, drafts, iterations, corrections, amendments from the other members of that committee. And the Declaration itself, not so well known or acknowledged in American history books, was predicated upon earlier declarations. That is the Plakat in the Netherlands in 1581 and the 1689 resolutions in Britain. So there's absolutely no shame in building on prior documents, just like our Constitution was predicated on earlier documents, including those of the several states. But I think it is important to note that this tremendous fuss has been made over Jefferson, the Graff House, and the Declaration House, appropriately so, but none about Morris and the Constitution in Philadelphia yet. So I just wanted to highlight that particular point. And for me, one of the really strong circumstantial pieces of evidence that Miss Daly's is where, in all probability, Morris did draft the final version of the Constitution. We know certainly that it was where conversation and motivation and ideation took hold at the boarding house. But I think some very compelling evidence to suggest that he actually did draft it there is the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that he was pointedly absent the 10th and 11th of September from the convention itself. Um, By the way, just one brief comment here. Again, as I pointed out earlier, you can usually pick out Morris well in any depiction of the signing of the Constitution, and you can see him on the right there and his wooden peg leg. This there as he approaches Washington and his chair. So coming back here to Washington and his significance. I mentioned how they, interestingly enough, became extremely close and friendly. It's interesting during the course of the convention itself, the Morrises in Washington went fishing on at least two occasions, a kind of an interesting diversion for the three of them. And I think it's important to recognize how influential Morris was. He actually asked Washington, not knowing that he was on his deathbed at the time, to run for president again in 1800. But I think there's an interesting quote here, and it reflects his extreme estimation of Washington, the man, and his character. This from a letter that he wrote to him just after the convention. I will add my conviction that of all men, you are best fitted to fill that office. Your cool, steady temper is indispensably necessary to give a firm and manly tone to the new government. To constitute a well-poised political machine is the task of us common workmen. But to set it in motion requires still greater qualities. When once a-going, it will proceed a long time for the original impulse. Time gives to primary institutions the mighty power of habit and custom. The law, both of wise men and fools, serves as the great commentator of human establishments, and like other commentators, as frequently obscures as it explains the text. But no constitution is the same on paper and in life. The exercise of authority depends on personal character. You therefore must, I say must, mount this seat, that the result may be as pleasing to you as it will be useful to them. I wish, but do not expect. You will, however, on this, as on other occasions, feel that interior satisfaction and self-approbation which interestingly, though, it was, in fact, if you ever have the opportunity to be in Virginia State Capitol and see the Houdon statue of Washington, you are looking at Washington's head, but you're looking at Morris's frame. It was actually his body which provided Houdon in Paris with the model for the statue in the Virginia State Capitol. And the two of them shared something in common, which is they were both very tall men by the standards of their time. So what drew Morris overseas? Well, it's fair to say that it was really first and foremost commercial interests. He went at the behest of Robert Morris, and I won't go into the particular details of the tobacco contract that he had with France, or some of the land speculations that were being offered in Europe, as well as dealing with U.S. debts. But in addition to his commercial interests, he was asked by Washington to explore the possibilities of coming up with a better commercial relationship with Great Britain at the time. That effort did not succeed, I have to say, but was nonetheless very well supported and regarded by Washington, and after which he was made Minister Plenipotentiary to Paris I see I've gone way over my time here, so I'm going to be rapid in going through the last couple of points here. Uh, One of the reasons that Morris fell into somewhat disregard is that unlike Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, who were uncritically adoring of the French Revolution, Morris saw realistically exactly what he had feared at the time of crafting our own Constitution, and that is the risk of the tyranny of the mob. And indeed, he not only was prescient, but remarkably predicted the outcome of the French Revolution, its resort to terror, and ultimately to end in the despotism of the triumvirate and then Bonaparte himself. He made some critical observations during the course of the revolution, and it is quite clear that Washington listened to him much more assiduously than he did to Jefferson, thankfully. And he made this comment, disorder and injustice go often together. Indeed, the one gives pretext, means, and temptation for the other. He also, while there, of course, endeavored to be helpful to Lafayette, who came to him as Lafayette, Jefferson, and Morris himself worked to create a potential constitution for the French. But of course, that had limited success and duration. And Lafayette himself, once he put the wheels in motion, came afoul of the Jacobins in control in a succession of different leadership changes over the course of the revolution. And Morris has an interesting quote about Lafayette. He says, he tells me that he is sensible that his party are mad and tells them so, but is not the less determined to die with them. I tell him that I think it would be quite as well to bring them to their senses and instead to live with them. Lafayette, of course, wound up in prison. Morris exercised great efforts to get him ultimately liberated, and in fact, lent Lafayette and his wife considerable sum of money to help him escape and live during and after his imprisonment. That loan was never repaid, I have to say. But it's illustrative of his humanity and caring for people in suffering, which he did repeatedly during the course of the revolution, including trying to help Marie Antoinette escape the guillotine. Many have seen this as a testament to Morris's sympathy towards monarchy. Absolutely incorrect. What he did have was a genuine recognition that every country had to abide by its own constitution, by its own set of laws and standards. And he famously said, every country must have a constitution suited to its circumstances. The true object of a great statesman is to give to any particular nation the kind of laws which is suitable to them and the best constitution which they are capable of. I think that's a very different take on the circumstances. And then just really wrapping up a little bit very quickly, his career, he came, again, not so well known. He always had an extreme vision for the future of the country, including extending the commercial activity and vitality of the cities into the western parts of the country, and was an early envisioner and then advocate and served as a chairman of the Erie Canal Commission. Sadly, he died before it was finished, but it was largely his vision that helped really ground and get this important piece of infrastructure underway in America. I mentioned that in his later years, after he came back to the States, he served briefly in the Senate representing New York, and then largely reverted, tired somewhat of politics, although he was always active in writing and expressing his displeasure on certain things. He also had the stature to break at times with Federalist policy. He advocated for the Louisiana Purchase, for example, and wasn't afraid of taking them on, including the interests of the state of New York. He advocated for Vermont in that particularity. Um, and he was always a person of great integrity and status and principle in all that he did. He ultimately went back, though, to focus on his commercial interests, living in the estate Morrisania in the South Bronx, which no longer stands, I have to say, but even if the name pertains to parts of the South Bronx. And it was there that he married late in life to Anne Carey Randolph, a woman of beauty, but with a very scandalous past. And again, I think it shows a lot of Morris's standard and principles, that he was willing to look beyond a really horrific reputation that she had from Virginia or in her early days, and embrace her as part of his household and then as his wife on Christmas Day in 1809, to the startled reaction of his guests that evening. And recognizing that many were critical of his marrying a much younger woman at the time, he made the following observation. If the world were to live with my wife, I should certainly have considered its taste. But as that happens not to be the case, I thought I might, without offending others, endeavor to suit myself. And so he did. And that's the other project that we're working on currently, which is to really um, uh, help the beautiful little Episcopal Church in the South Bronx in Morrisania, St. Anne's, that was built in honor of Anne Carey Randolph, the mother of Gouverneur Morris Jr., their only child together, um, and in which Gouverneur Morris and his wife and Lewis and other members of the family and the community are buried. Sadly, unlike the sanctuary, which is in fairly good repair, the crypt itself is in quite poor condition, and we're eager, excuse me, not only to preserve and restore it, but to create it as a community, national, and even international center to pay appropriate respects to this great founder's founder, Gouverneur Morris. I'm going to pause there, and if people are still hanging in, I'm open to questions and answers, and then we'll briefly wrap up with one final comment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Timothy. This was such an incredible presentation, and we love when we see the passion and the knowledge of the speakers really shine, and you certainly did that tonight. And it's just a testament to how much you have to share about this incredible founding father that I'm sure we could have talked for another 3 hours here about his life. Now, what biography would you recommend to start with? I also want to say it's so wonderful for the opportunity for a lot of Hamilton fans to learn more about Gouverneur Morris, because 10 years ago, Hamilton was in a very similar boat. He was not well known. And so it's just wonderful to have you bring him to us and have us learn more about his life. But if they're looking to learn more, what of those books that you mentioned that were all great would you recommend to start with?
So I would say, some of the more accessible ones are Brookhiser's, but you shouldn't ignore Kershke's. I think his is extremely well written, as is Adams's, William Howard Adams's. They're slender enough volumes that they can be digested on their own. So any of those three, I would say, would be great entry points. And uh, Teddy Roosevelt is always a good place to go as well. So.
Fantastic. We also had a question, well, more of a comment. If you could please say something about the abolitionists of the American Convention and Morris's role at the convention on this issue.
Oh, I'm so glad for that question, because I realized as I felt I was running over time that I sped through one of the most critical moments of the Constitutional Convention. And it's the one in which Morris really shows his stripes in the most extraordinary way. So forgive me, but I am going to read a little bit from that moment at the convention because he is the only one to have spoken with this vehemence at the time of the convention. I quote, I never will concur in upholding domestic slavery. It is a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Upon what principle shall slaves be computed in the representation? This is about the three-fifths compromise. Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondage shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. I will add that domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of the proposed Constitution. The vassalage of the poor has ever been the favorite offspring of aristocracy. And finally, I will sooner submit myself to a tax for paying for all the Negroes in the United States than saddle posterity with such a constitution. Pretty
Beautiful.
formidable.
Thank you for the question and thank you for that beautiful answer. We have a question here from Jose. Where can I learn more about the effort to save the church in the South Bronx? I'm a resident in the South Bronx and want to help in the effort to save the church.
Music to my ears. So that is fantastic. If it's possible, I'll just go back to this particular side. The Bronx Preservation Society has been created. I'll just say it's called the Morrisania Project. Please, I'm happy to make my contact information available. And this is an important undertaking for the South Bronx, for our nation, and I would argue for the world, because ours is the oldest written constitution in the world and the inspiration for constitutions globally.
Wonderful. And we had a comment about someone, if you could touch a little bit more on the grid of Manhattan and
Oh, yes.
Morris's role with that.
So, among other things, in his later years, I mean, the man was extraordinary because he had his finger in so many different pies, if you will. But he was on the commission that established the grid system in Manhattan. So we have him to thank for that very simple and effective structure for the infrastructure of our great city of New York.
Wonderful. And there's another comment here. Hamilton, Jay, and Washington were central to the spy network of the American Patriots. Did Gouverneur Morris play any role in that network during the Revolutionary War?
So I'm not really equipped to make that comment. I don't believe so, but it would require further research to make more definitive. I've never seen any references to his involvement in that. Wouldn't surprise
Wonderful.
me, but
Good. Well, and I just to uh, wrap. Does Morris have any living descendants at this time? Have you connected with any of them in these efforts?
So he does, and it's very interesting. If any of you happen to be familiar with the state of Rhode Island or Newport, in Newport, there's a mansion there called Chepstow. And you may have heard me mention earlier, Morris was of Welsh ancestry, and his ancestors played a critical role in Cromwell's assault on Chepstow Castle. And so they named a mansion that the descendants of Morris occupied until fairly recently, I would say. And there you see a lot of Morris ephemera still gathered, and of all places, Newport, Rhode Island, where he never lived, but his descendants did. And so there are prominent branches of that, one of which is the McCormick family. And we are hoping that any descendants will not only be advocates for our project in Philadelphia to get the site of the writing of the final draft of the Constitution memorialized in a marker there, which Adam Levinson and I are working on daily, but also to support this initiative to get the crypt restored and preserved at St. Anne's in Morrisania, and hopefully to create something of a broader visitor experience there for visitors from around the world.
Fantastic. And as you mentioned, Adam Levinson, he will be our speaker at next month's event. And as you can see from some of what Timothy shared today, the incredible research that Adam has been doing on this subject, and you will learn more about that in our presentation next month. And so the registration will go out soon. We hope to see you so you can learn more about that. And just to wrap it up, I want to bring it back to Hamilton himself. I really appreciated that you opened the presentation talking about Morris' connection to Hamilton. Another amazing fact is I believe that he was the one that led the efforts to secretly raise funds so that Mrs. Hamilton, the widow, and all of her
Absolutely.
children could remain in the Grange. And so I think it really speaks to what you said about his many philanthropical efforts and how much he cared and really looked after his friends. And I thought the quote that you shared from the funeral ovation or uh, the funeral oration that Gouverneur Morris made about Hamilton was beautiful. And I just wanted to close with another really amazing quote about Hamilton, referring more to his Revolutionary War service. But he said, such was his zeal, and so brilliant his service, that we heard his name before we knew his person. It seemed as if God had called him suddenly into existence that he may assist to save a world. So I think that's just really beautiful of his friend and so many other beautiful quotes that he had and the respect that he had for Hamilton and how much they worked together and really how much overlap they had. So thank you again, Timothy, for bringing this knowledge of Gouverneur Morris to us. I hope that you all will connect to learn more. The AHA Society is also supporting these efforts to not only get Gouverneur Morris more recognition, but also some of this historic preservation work that Timothy and others are spearheading. So please stay in touch with us, stay in touch with Timothy Schantz, and we look forward to seeing you at a future AHA event. Thank you again to Timothy and to all of you for being here. Have a great night.